Wendy is a LSCSW, a professor and associate chair of the California State University of Northridge's Masters of Social Work program. Dr. Ashley received her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Roykin College and her MSW from the University of Southern California. She has been a licensed clinical social worker since 1998 and has over 20 years of social work experience in the areas of community mental health, child welfare, addiction recovery. Dr. Ashley is the author of multiple publications, speaks at conferences nationwide and internationally, maintains a private practice, and provides training for multiple community agencies. Research interests include treatment models for working with African American and transgender clients, creative engagement of involuntary clients, the impact of power and privilege on macro and micro practice, and child welfare. She is passionate about promoting social justice and infuses an intersectionality lens in her teaching, practice, and research. I'd like to bring up here to Wendy Ashley and
Okay, I'm Dr. Wendy Ashley. Am I too loud? Is that better? Okay, I'll just stand back here. I go by the pronouns she, her, and hers, and this is Randy Robertson, and he goes by the pronouns he, him, and his. The title of this presentation is Trans Attraction, not kink or fetish, but a legitimate sexual orientation. And I'm about to get edgy as F for you. All right, here we go. Okay, so there are a couple things that I want to talk about before we get started with this presentation, specifically about critical consciousness. And the first is to really think about where you go when you get uncomfortable. This is a potentially provocative subject. Anytime you introduce something new, it's potentially provocative. So I'm having a hard time here. Okay. I really want you to think about what your default is. For some people, when they get uncomfortable, they disconnect. For others, when they get uncomfortable, they start getting on their phone. Others make inappropriate humor. Be aware of who you are and where you go, just because when that happens, the conversation and the learning stops. I'm going to introduce to you a sexual orientation beyond the traditional binary. And what I want to caution you to be aware of is what I call third space oppression. When we talk about binaries, third space is the position, the space between the two binaries. When we're uncomfortable with non-traditional identities, sometimes what we do is inadvertently silence others, marginalizing and further invisibilizing subgroups of people. I don't want you to do that. So this is Randy Robertson, as I said, and he was my client, and we worked together clinically for several years. He is going to make himself vulnerable, similar to Alex today, in telling his story. When do we ever get a chance to hear people's stories, honestly and openly, when they're not in crisis, right? So what I'm asking is, number one, that you respect his confidentiality. Please don't share his story with people that have not been here to witness it. And please take a position of curiosity. He is not going to use the same language that those of us in the mental health field use. He is going to use his own language to talk about his own lived experience. So what I would invite you to do is be curious as opposed to critiquing him. Fair enough? All right. I need you guys to have a little more coffee next time. I think I have to move to the side because I can't see my own PowerPoint. All right, so we have a specific agenda. There's a lot of things I'm going to cover. And I'm just going to keep clicking until they come up. All right, so the first is that I'm going to just spend a couple of brief seconds, since we've already had a great introduction, talking about binaries, stigma, and bias. Then I'm going to give you an epistemological or a philosophical framework of all the different ways that we are currently looking at trans attraction. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm going to define that as well. So I'm going to talk about the academic perspective. I'm going to talk about the medical perspective. I'm going to talk about the DSM and fetishes and paraphilia. I'm going to talk about Randy is going to tell his story. I'm going to give my clinical lens. We're going to talk about where trans attraction came from and why that has become important. And then if we have time, we're going to ask questions. If we have time. Okay, so the definition of trans attraction that we have come up with is the physical and emotional attraction to a trans-identified person. Okay, that's the definition we're going to use. Physical and emotional attraction to a trans-identified person. Can this include non-binary folks? Absolutely, but specifically, we're talking about trans attraction. Before I get to this slide, let me just say a couple of things. This presentation is based on practice-informed research. Are there any researchers in the room? Okay, there's a couple of you. Most of you are not researchers. That's good. The lens that this is ethnographic, critical approach to research. So that means that I'm not using a quantitative, randomized controlled trial. Because it's ethnographic, what it means is that it's real people telling their real life stories, right? And without this kind of research, what we get are dominant binaries that define what our agendas, what our interventions, and what our evidence-based protocols look like, right? And those don't work for people that are marginalized. So the purpose of including invisible populations and invisible voices is to change the forefront of our research. I want to acknowledge, just starting this presentation, that I am cisgender and heterosexual. I am not a member of the LGBTQ community. Okay, my reflexive positioning in relation to this research is as an ally, a clinician, a researcher, and a social justice advocate. I have privilege as a researcher and an educator, and I'm using that to evoke change. It's gonna get better, roll with me. All right. So you see here one of those internet beautiful slides about binaries. And I just want to talk for a second about binaries, right? Because human beings by nature attempt to put everything into categories, right? Into binary states. Cis, trans, straight, gay, masculine, feminine, right? We do that naturally. But the thing about binary thinking is that it bifurcates, separates, and polarizes elements into two mutually exclusive categories, which promotes binary decision-making. Okay, binary decision-making is based on inaccurate, faulty information, right? There's an assumption that there's only two options. And because of that, it often results in division, disconnection, and disastrous consequences. I'm not saying that we're getting rid of all binaries. Bless you. What I'm challenging you to do is to practice tolerating and suspending your own binary categorizations and allow for additional elements to emerge. Like, I didn't know what gray sexuality was. I'm learning something new already, right? This is a new thing to think about. And the point of that is to shift your perspective into a more balanced and inclusive one. Be aware of the limitations in binaries in capturing the nuances and complexities of individuals. There are a couple of things that I feel like come up for me over and over again as I think about sex, gender, sexuality, and gender expression binaries. You probably know these, but I'm gonna say them anyway. One is how you identify or present in any one of those categories does not impact how you present in the other categories, right? That seems obvious, but for a lot of people, if I identify as female, as cisgender, then I should have a certain kind of gender expression, right? I shaved my head a few years ago and I got misgendered all the time, right? So each of those, right, depends on the individual. The other, someone said this a few years ago, but it's always resonated with me, is that who you are is not defined by what you do. Behavior doesn't dictate identity. And that becomes more important as we talk about this category in particular. Here's why I'm saying all this. Part of the work in moving beyond the binary is identifying your own biases and rigidity. And the other is recognizing that whatever privilege you are holding may prevent you from seeing beyond your own experiences. Because of that, you might never fully get it. We do a lot of talking about understanding, and so I would encourage you not to spend your energy trying to understand. Use your energy to develop flexibility and fluidity so that you can more effectively connect with people around you. Okay, let's have some fun. So what is bias? Do we know what bias is? You all are looking at me like you've never seen anybody talk about bias. Right? All right, bias. So bias is a preference for or a prejudice against a person or group of people, yes? And the thing about bias, here's where it gets fun, is that even though we may wholeheartedly believe in social justice and human rights, Those embedded, unconscious biases are often contrary to our belief systems, right? So again, pay attention to what your internal experience is and what feelings you might have that are contrary to your belief system. So we're gonna do a little bit of an activity real quick, okay? I'm gonna show you some photos of some celebrities, and I want you to name them as they come up. Can you do that? Okay, great. Some of you are willing to do that. All right, here we go. All right. Who's that? Justin Bieber. Who's that? Thank you, old school R&B, our rappers. That's Mace. Chiggy. Come on. Some people listen to other music, right? Gavin Rossdale. Oops. Don't jump to him. That's Matt Lauer. That was Little Bow Wow. Thank you, Eddie Murphy. That's right, Kendra Wilkinson's husband, his name is Hank Baxter. Come on, look at those lips. That's LL Cool J. Yes, Malik Yoba, very good. Do we have any feelings about these people? Yes? You love their work, you hate their work, you love them, you hate them, you want to have sex with them, something like that, yeah? All right. I have similar feelings. What do they have in common? They're male? Yes, that's true. So each of them have been accused of engaging in relationships with trans women. Any feelings now? Here's what I want you to do. Take a second and check in with your immediate cognitive and emotional reactions. I don't want you to share it, but I do want you to be aware of any fluttering of bias you might be experiencing. Trans attraction questioning has led many well-known men to adamantly defend their heterosexuality and has tarnished the reputation and careers of others. It sounds like silliness on the outside, but oftentimes when gossip blogs are the public's only exposure to trans women, it spreads misinformation, validates stereotypes, and causes irreparable damage. When a man can be shamed for merely interacting with a trans woman, whether it be through a photograph, a sex tape, or correspondences, what does this say about how society views trans women? This pervasive ideology says that trans women are shameful. It says that trans women are not worthy of being seen, and that trans women must remain a secret, invisible and disposable. If a man, a celebrity, is seen with a trans woman, he will likely lose social capital, so he has to adamantly deny, vehemently demean, or trash the woman in question. He must do this to maintain his standing in our patriarchal society. I ask you, what kind of setup is this for trans women and their partners? So what I hope you will start to see are some of the challenges to identification as trans attractive. Our current trans misogynistic socio-political climate is one in which trans and non-binary populations face inordinate amounts of stigma, discrimination, and violence. In 2018, there was at least 26 deaths of transgender and gender non-conforming people in the US due to fatal violence, the majority of whom were Black trans women. These victims were killed by acquaintances, partners, and strangers, some who were arrested and charged, others who have yet to be identified. Most of us are well aware of the dangers to the trans population, but have we considered the challenges facing their partners, lovers, and significant others? So a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. The first challenging barrier facing trans attraction identification is stigma. I have to look over here, sorry to you. In heteronormative and hypergendered circles, what we find is that attraction to trans women is taboo, okay? Oftentimes, trans women's bodies are perceived as either weapons or sex toys. When we start to think about cisgender women versus transgender women, we often hold trans women to the same standards of beauty. So trans women don't get to be beautiful for who they are. They got to stand up to cis women's standards of beauty. So what dynamic we create with that is the idea that you have to pass to be sexy. What we often promote with that kind of ideology is that I can fuck you, but I can't love you. It's very sad to me. I was seeing, on a side note, I saw a young man who was about 18 a few years ago, and he was living with his dad, and they were very religious. They were Russian Jews. And the dad said, it's totally okay to fuck those girls, but you don't get to love them and you don't get to be with them, right? And to the point that he was willing to cut his son off and threaten the woman with violence because that was that serious in his cultural and religious lens. The second issue is questions about identity, right? And so one of the things that we question trans-attracted folks around is their sexuality. Well, if you are attracted to a trans person, then you must be gay. That's one of the first accusations, right? When we talk about sex, it also depends on what you're actually doing in the bedroom, right? And it's interesting, if you're cis and you're hetero, nobody ever asks you what you're doing in the bedroom. But if you're trans or trans-attracted or queer, people want to know, are you topping? Are you pegging? Are you bottoming? What are you doing? And based on that positioning, that determines your sexuality. Also, what folks often find is that their masculinity gets questioned, right? Specifically, men who are attracted to trans women, okay? There becomes a question of, if you like a dick, does that mean that you're gay? Or that mean that you're not masculine? There becomes questions about that. And the final area is in regards to safety. Just like we are concerned about trans women's safety, we also want to consider the safety for trans-attracted folks. How open and out can they be when the level of hate and violence is this high for trans women? What we find is that this creates a feeling of hypervigilance, right? Hypervigilance is when you spend your energy looking around for threats. So we find that this exists in trans-attracted folks as well, where when they're with their family and their colleagues, they are anticipating that someone is gonna question them or disrespect them. They are projecting their fears, and then they are isolating themselves. But do you know who Janet Monk is? I love her so much. I'm about to show you her picture in a second. Okay, so this is her quote. It is rare for an openly trans woman, no matter how passable or attractive she is, to have a man who openly loves her, who has an unabashed desire to be seen with her, who proudly stands beside her, despite the stigma and other people's curiosities and inappropriate questions. Those questions regarding their sexuality are constant and fraught with assumptions, and for a man less secure, it can be difficult navigating these questions. Until we begin checking how we delegitimize the identities, bodies, and existence of trans women, and stigmatize the men who yearn to be with us, we will continue to marginalize our men, who don't have the space to explore, define, and embrace their attraction to various women. There she is. So, what I want to do is give you an epistemological lens, right? I want to talk a little bit about the philosophical and theoretical frameworks that we use to understand this population. And what I want you to think about is these frameworks tell us how to make sense of this group, but they also maintain binaries and pathologize groups of people. And I want you to hold those two at the same time. I'm really struggling with this, Cameron. Okay, I gotta go to the side of it. All right, so the academic literature calls, and again, right, the academic literature has a name for men who have sex with trans women. They call them MSTGWs. Okay, there is not information about women who have sex with trans men. And what you're gonna hear is a lot of this. That we have a lot of information about cis men having sex with trans women, but not the other way around. I've been doing a literature review on this for the last 5 years, and this is a relatively invisible population. What we know through the research is that folks who identify as men who have sex with trans women identify as heterosexual, gay, bisexual, asexual, and other. What most of them said was that, in this one study that I'm citing, most of them identified as straight or bi, but felt pressure to determine what they were in a limiting binary. What we find is that we know about this group mostly through eroticism, kink, fetish, and paraphilia, but because they challenge conventional sexual orientation categories, they're often designated to subsets, right? We say that they are a subset under bisexual, or a subset or a variant of heterosexuality, or something unusual and deviant. Okay? Ultimately, what I need you to hear is that when you are not given your own room to determine your identity, what it does is it excludes you from validation and it keeps you from having community support. All of us need to belong somewhere, right? And without that, it's pretty lonely. All right, so the medical world is a good time. The language that they use to describe men who have sex with trans women is gyandromorphophilic. Let's say that together. Gyandromorphophilic. It's like eating mashed potatoes. Gyandromorphophilic. Or GAMS. And interestingly, just like the academic world, gyandromorphophilic men are cis men who have sex with trans women. There is no term for cis women who have sex with trans men. Okay, gyandromorphophilics, or GAMPs, are attracted to gyandromorphs. That's the word. Gyandromorphs are described in the medical literature as natal males with both breasts and a penis. Okay, there is no nomenclature for masculine women with no breasts and a vagina, or someone that has surgical reaffirmation or reassignment. Okay, the only medical terms we have are someone that was born a boy but has breasts and penis. Don't you find that interesting? That is so disturbing to me. What we also find is a couple of things, right? Is that the way in which the medical world looks at sexual orientation is that there's not any terminology to capture the complexities and nuances of people's identity and behavior, right? And there's this assumption that everybody wants to be in a binary position, right? And so people's lived experiences and narratives get invisibilized. This is my favorite thing ever. This is so disgusting. So even though the medical world is saying that they get it and that they understand the trans experience, listen to this quote. This is a quote from 2017. This is not 1850 or 1950. This is 2017. While it is reasonable for transgender women to object to being called male, they are still genetically male, which is the basis of the word male in she-male. Okay, this is a medical person saying that it is okay to call a trans woman she-male because they are genetically male. Like, no acknowledgement, no acceptance of identity. What does that do to our healthcare system? Right? No one's with me on this? Okay. I just want a little excitement. Thank you. All right, so let's talk a little bit about erotica. So our mainstream media 100% oversimplifies, sensationalizes, or makes invisible transgender and genderqueer people's erotic identities, sex lives, and fantasies. Okay, one of the first people that we knew about, and it's interesting, right? We'll talk about the DSM in a few minutes, but Christine Jorgensen, that's our homegirl at the top on the right, in 1953, she was one of the first people to publicly transition, okay? And that she really challenged because she was a celebrity, so she challenged the rigid gender role expectations. She publicly got sexual reaffirmation surgery and was one of the first people that was like public and people got to see the change. The dichotomy that they set up for Christine Jorgensen was that she was either a bombshell or she was Frankenstein. Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a monster that was stitched together. That's the metaphors that we're using to describe somebody that's gone through transition. Right? Terrible. Erotica. Erotica historically has a heteronormative lens, yes? And context. When we see trans characters or trans elements, they're often in the subtext. So they get to be fun, but that their perspective isn't utilized as much. When trans identities are in erotica, they are seen as unique, they are seen as different and freakish. And we see them in very specific roles, like dominant straight or forced femme. There are some outliers. That's Buck Angel, and that's Yasmin Lee. Do you know about them? Right? Yeah, we should give them a hand. And they are changing the face of erotica and porn. They are changing the face, right? There's Gal Pal Films and Fox House Films. Those are production companies that are headed by trans women. But outside of that, erotica and porn are really about heteronormative lenses. Pornography in particular caters to straight cis men. So when trans women are portrayed, they are fetishized. Typically, we see chicks with dicks topping cis men. And of course, we come to kink. And kink is a broad term that basically refers to, the way it's defined as consensual, non-traditional, sexual, sensual, and intimate behaviors. So we're talking about BDSM, we're talking about erotic role play, we're talking about fetishism. Basically anything that's not vanilla sex, right? The good news is that we have more support for kink positive and sex positive identities. But again, right, what is the role of trans folks and trans attracted folks in this picture? Very fetishized often and very seen from a very heteronormative lens. Are you guys with me still? Yeah. Okay. Are you bored? No. Because I could do a dance routine too. I'm into that. I have a friend who can come dance with me. Sorry. I can't. I need like a person to do this for me. Okay, I have to look over here again. So let's talk about the DSM. Oh, I did it again. Look at me. Okay, so the DSM, any clinicians in the room? Yeah. Yes, welcome friends. The DSM is a train wreck. It is. It's a train wreck. Yeah. Okay, I put a little history, and I say history because it's his story, right? But we do need to use the DSM, but we need to be aware of how limiting and pathologizing it is. So the DSM-1 in 1952 described sexual deviations, notice the word deviations, as criminal acts. Anybody that did anything that wasn't vanilla and missionary position was deviant, okay? And in the DSM-1, to be gay was a disorder. That was in 1952. Remember Christine Jorgensen didn't transition until 53, so she was in the midst of all this, right? In 1968, the DSM-2 came out and defined sexual deviations as a broad category. But here's the fun part. They saw sexual deviations as personality disorders. So now, not only are you deviant, but there's something wrong with your character too. Still, being gay was still a disorder. It wasn't until 1980. Can you even believe this? 1980 that we took being gay out of the DSM. 1980. And we replaced it with identity disorder. So we decided not to pick on queer folks, we picked on trans folks. Right? We also, in the DSM-3, introduced paraphilia, which we'll talk about in a second. And in the DSM-4 in 1994, transvestic disorder, which is cross-dressing, was included, but it only applied to hetero males. So if I cross-dress, it doesn't mean anything. But if a hetero male does it, then that's a disorder. So what I want you to hear is the flavor of how pathologizing our book is, right? Here's the definition for paraphilia. And this is the DSM-5. So in the DSM-5, paraphilia is defined as a persistent, intense, atypical sexual arousal pattern. That sounds like a good time to me. Atypical? Intense? What? That's a party! Okay, here's the thing. Here's the thing. The DSM-5 did something lovely and also insane. It separated paraphilia from paraphilic disorder. So what the DSM-5 said was, you could be as freaky as you want to, unless it's a problem. Okay? And a problem in the DSM-5 was distress, impairment in functioning, or involving an unwilling or non-consenting partner. So basically what the DSM tried to do was to separate the fact that we can be as freaky as we want to be, as long as somebody's not getting dragged into it without consent. And here's some of the examples of the things that are paraphilias. So you can be a voyeur, you can like to watch, you can like to be an exhibitionist, you can like to show people, you can like to be a frauderistic person and rub up against people. You can be involved in BDSM on either side. You can be pedophilic, you can like little kids, you can like shoes, and you can like cross-dressing, okay? Or whatever your fetish is. Okay, but again, right, the distinction, and the DSM is trying. It's a train wreck of a book, but it's trying to start to separate freakiness from disorders. Again, still pathologizing. Now, this slide kills me. These are 4 paraphilias that no one has ever heard of that are related to the trans community. Now, the part that upsets me about this is, number one, I've never heard of them. I've been a clinician for 25 years, and I have no idea what these are. But number two, we have these obscure terms that are used to pathologize people that nobody knows about. So we have andromorphophilic, which is attraction to trans men, gyandromorphophilic, which is attraction to trans women, transvestophilia, attraction to a transvestite, and heliosexual, attraction to non-binary. Have you heard of these? No. That's crazy, right? I'm just saying we should write a letter or something. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to have Randy come up and give his story. Okay, again, I want you to be thoughtful about the fact that this takes a lot of vulnerability and guts to do this, right? And be kind to him. Let's give him a big hand.
Isn't Wendy amazing? Yeah, I think so too. I'd like to thank Wendy for inviting me to share my story here, along with the Edgy conference. The reason that I'm speaking here today is to raise awareness and to inform people that trans attraction is a legitimate orientation and not a fetish. And that there's normal guys like me that are attracted to transgender women and have long-term successful relationships. So my story. I was born in 1968 in Marin County, California, just outside of San Francisco. My mother was 16 when she had me, so instead of being a well-fed mother or endure the abuse that she had, she gave me up for adoption. When I was 3 days old, I went home from the hospital to my new parents, Richard and Madeline Robertson. I was the second child that was adopted. They had adopted a girl 2 years before, named Fiona. And then when I was 3 years old, my parents divorced. I was so young then, I never remembered them actually being together. They remained friends for us kids. My dad would visit us at Christmas and Thanksgiving. And being young, I had a pretty happy childhood, even though my parents were divorced. And I thought I was straight. I didn't know there was any other option. I had crushes on girls in elementary school. I had crushes on actresses on TV, like Lindsay Wagner from the Bionicle Man. Who else? Barbara Eden from I Dream of Jeannie. When I would spend the summers with my dad, I would raid his Playboy collection and fantasize for hours over these beautiful airbrushed women. In 1978, my mom, sister, and I were living in Camp Rio, and she had to move because of her work to Sonoma up north to work at Sonoma State Hospital. It was a very, very hard time for all of us. I think I cried for 3 months because I was away from my friends in Southern California. My mother didn't have any friends, so she started drinking heavily. And going into junior high school, which was a shock, I started failing my classes, probably because of a lot of stuff that was going on at home. And then when my sister was 14, she tried to commit suicide. And she said that it was because of my mother's drinking, which had something to do with it, but she had her own sexual identity issues as well. She decided to go live with my father. So I was alone, I was left alone with my mother, and we had a very codependent relationship. I remembered being afraid to come home for fear that she was going to be drunk. Several times I'd have to pick her up off the bathroom floor after she passed out. This was very, very traumatic and something that a child should not have to go through. It was at that time, it was at that time that I started using drugs. In my teenage years, I had sex with a lot of women, or girls, and enjoyed it. I did feel something was missing after sex, like a connection. I was unaware of transsexuals at the time, but I started to be attracted to androgynous guys. And I started seeing this one androgynous guy in our small town. He was kind of like the boy George of the town. He wore makeup and dressed androgynously. And being the small town that Sonoma was, word got out. My friends confronted me on it, saying, "Are you going out with a guy?" And of course I denied it. And then after that, they stopped hanging out with me. My mother disowned me a couple times because of my sexuality, so I moved out. And I was in relationships with feminine men at the time, off and on. On the weekends, I would drive to San Francisco to go to clubs, and on the way home, I would drive by Larkin Street in San Francisco. This is the street where all the transsexual prostitutes would hang out. They would hang out on the sidewalks while the Johns would drive around and around, and then they would stop, and then girls would get in the car. This is my first exposure to transsexuals. And then every time I would go home, I would always circle that, never stop, but I would circle and look at the women. That was my first exposure. I moved to San Francisco and then got involved in a relationship with a trans woman, and then I felt like this is it. This is what I was missing. I never felt a part of the gay community, although I labeled myself that in my early 20s because there wasn't a word for a man that was attracted to transgender women. And that's part of the problem too, because I was on my own. There's no community that I could get support from. I was in that relationship for 3 years, and after that I moved to Los Angeles about 16 years ago. I met a woman, a trans woman. We had a relationship for about 10 years, and then she decided that she wanted her sexual reassignment surgery. And I thought I would be okay with it because I loved her, and I thought it was, being attracted to the person. But we ended up ending the relationship because of that, and then some other issues. We had a lot of other issues too. Then I met another woman who I married. Her name is Samantha. She's a very amazing woman. She has a career in the healthcare industry. She has her own physical therapy, home health business. She's very outgoing. It was like finding my unicorn. And it's been 5 years. We've been married for 5 years. She's pre-op and doesn't want surgery because she's happy with her penis. Despite the belief in the medical community, not all trans women want sexual reassignment surgery. Even Samantha had to educate Kaiser Hospital after the fact when she had an argument with her endocrinologist, after which they had a meeting with all the staff to make them aware of this fact. We've had challenges in our relationships, as all, relationships have. There's been awkward times, like when introducing her to my family and friends. There was also fear what my colleagues at work would think when I would bring her to my Christmas party. I got over my fears by not caring what people think. Also, I thought to myself, no matter judgment that I could receive is nothing compared to what Samantha deals with on a daily basis. I love this woman. I'm very proud of her. And like I said, the reason that I'm speaking here is just a way to bring up awareness that there are men like me that are, pretty normal, that are attracted to transgender women, and that can be successful and have a happy life. Thank you.
So I just want to talk a couple of minutes about my clinical work with Randy, because I think that that's where all of this presentation has come from, right? And my clinical lens, there are 3 parts to my clinical work with him. The first was attachment theory that I used, the second was queer theory, and the third was trauma-informed. And I just wanted to say a little bit about each of those, right? Because for those of you that aren't as familiar with attachment theory really talks about the psychological connectedness between parents and children, right? It's the context in which parents really provide safety and security for their children. And attachment is important for a million reasons, but the 2 biggest ones that I find important in my work are, number 1, that they allow for emotional regulation, right? That you know how to soothe yourself and make sure you're okay. The second is that healthy attachment provides a template for future relationships. So not only can I get what I need internally, but I can get it interpersonally as well. And this becomes important with Randy because of the fact that he was adopted, because of the fact that his parents were divorced, and because of the alcohol abuse by his mom. Those are all things that disrupted his attachment, right? Queer theory is one of my favorite theories because it studies and critiques anything that is binary. Anything that is normative or deviant, specifically sexual identities and activities. And I also use a trauma-informed lens, and because Randy talked very openly about trauma. So a big part of our work was acknowledging the trauma that he's experienced, that considering how he's internalized that trauma, and just the peer and the family rejection and the not belonging, and how that shows up in his day-to-day life. I'm not going to tell you all of this, but what I am going to tell you is that the treatment plan that we came up with, number 1, we wanted to really look at those dynamics that Randy felt like were not accepting and threatening. He didn't get acceptance by his family, he didn't get acceptance by his colleagues, and he got rejected by his peers. So there was a lot of damage to repair, right? We paid attention to the narratives that he had about himself based on the experiences with other people. And one of the things we talked about was that Randy needed language to describe who he was. And that was very important because with that language, he could then find a community. Do you want to talk about this a little bit, or do you want me to talk about it? Okay, I'll just keep talking. So one of the things, I'm very much a fan of intersectionality, right? I like to look at people and all their diverse identities and the power and privilege associated with that. And one of the things that becomes important for Randy is that all of his visible identities are privileged. He's a white, cisgender, heterosexual male. He's attractive. He shows up with very strong privilege. So what happened is that his identity is very secret, his sexual identity. And so, and everybody would relate to him with the assumption that he was heterosexual and heteronormative and didn't have anything else going on. And so that perpetuated, and his wife is not white, right? His wife is trans and she's a woman of color. And so all of that created its own set of dynamics. And so it's super important. Like, what I don't want you to walk away from this is labeling this as only sexuality, right? This is a sexual orientation, but it's not all of someone's life. There's a lot of other things in addition to that. So our task was to create a new, there it goes. Our task was to move beyond the binary and develop a new sexuality. And the term that we came up with for this was trans attraction. We selected that name out of a lot of names, and you can see some of the additional kink names for folks that are trans attracted, right? Trans fan, tranny chaser, trans oriented, trans amorous, that's fun. Transsexual, we didn't know what these were before we came up with this. But we rejected a lot of the ones we knew about for a number of reasons. One was that we felt like they were less respectful of his personal orientation, and they were more about the trans person that he was with, and not about his own orientation. And really, we felt like because of that focus, they maintained his invisibility. So we came up with our own term. I want to draw your attention to the role of shame in all of this. Randy talked about it a little bit, but again, right, I talked a little bit earlier about third space identities. Trans attraction is a third space identity, and folks that identify in third spaces can feel a lot of shame, right, because they don't fit into the dominant sexual orientation binaries, and because, and wait for it, there's often a really strong reaction to alternate orientations with the assumption that the behavior and the orientation itself is deviant. Okay, check your own biases. Check the biases of people around, because even though people were well-intentioned, they were very hurtful to Randy. I don't have time for questions, but I do want to leave you with this quote from my boyfriend, Malik Yoba, who's not my boyfriend. I do love him. Come on, New York Undercover? Stop it. All right. This came out like this year, so this was a party. He said, uninformed young men haven't been taught by us that love is love and acceptance of trans love is okay, and bullying has nothing to do with masculinity or heterosexual behavior. Peers think that toxicity equals masculinity and humanity, that being a real man means we must disrespect and demean those that find themselves attracted to women of the trans experience. Trans people deserve love and respect, as do those of us that love them. As a heterosexual man, I love all women and count myself among those that find themselves trans attractive. He used my word. And I too feel the self-imposed shame that comes with the truth. But it's time to speak up. It is not about genitalia or sex, but about attraction to the soul and humanity of an individual, and often the beauty and courage and conviction to live one's truth. It's dope, right? So our goal today was to inform you, to educate you, and to destigmatize the lived experiences of Randy and all of those who identify as trans attracted. Thank you so much for your time and attention.